The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Pierce Technologies' headquarters in downtown Seattle, creating rivers of water that distorted the view of Puget Sound below. Alexander Pierce stood in his corner office on the 35th floor, reviewing code architecture for the company's latest AI security platform. At 37 years old, he had built one of the most innovative cybersecurity firms on the West Coast, transforming a college dorm room startup into a company valued at $3 billion. His software protected everything from hospitals to banks, from government agencies to Fortune 500 companies. Yet none of those achievements brought him as much peace as knowing his mother Grace lived comfortably in the guest house behind his modern Mercer Island estate. Grace Pierce had raised Alexander alone after his father died in a construction accident when Alexander was 9 years old. She had worked as a nurse at Harborview Medical Center, pulling double shifts, days in the ER, nights in the ICU, to afford the math and science camps that had sparked Alexander's love of technology. She never complained about the exhaustion, never resented the sacrifices. Now, at 68 years old, she lived in the custom-designed guest house Alexander had built for her, a light-filled space with accessible features and a small garden where she grew medicinal herbs from her nursing days. Her once dark hair had turned silver gray, cut in a practical short style, and her green eyes still held the calm competence of someone who had spent decades handling emergencies. Victoria Winters had entered Alexander's world 18 months ago at a tech industry gala in San Francisco. She was striking, 29 years old, with raven black hair that fell straight to her shoulders, ice blue eyes that seemed to calculate everything, and a sophisticated elegance that came from Stanford MBA and venture capital connections. She worked in tech marketing, though Alexander had noticed her role seemed more about networking at high-end events than actual work. Victoria had made him feel successful in ways that went beyond his bank account. She knew the right people, attended the right conferences, understood how to position Pierce Technologies for maximum visibility. 4 months ago, he had proposed to her on a private beach in Maui, and she had accepted with what seemed like genuine emotion. The wedding was planned for September, an elegant affair at a waterfront venue with 200 guests from the tech elite. Everything appeared optimal. Alexander had the success, the innovation, the perfect tech world partner, and his mother living safely nearby. He felt he had finally balanced professional achievement with personal happiness. If only he had been more observant, he might have noticed the malware corrupting his seemingly flawless system. Grace sat in the guest house living room, her hands shaking as she tried to read a medical journal. The bruise on her shoulder throbbed where Victoria had grabbed her yesterday, hidden beneath her long-sleeved blouse. She kept glancing nervously toward the main house, watching for any sign of Victoria's white Tesla. Victoria had left for a networking breakfast 2 hours ago, but Grace never knew when she might return unexpectedly. The anxiety had become constant, like a low-grade fever that never quite broke. It had started subtly, maybe 5 months after the engagement. At first, just dismissive comments, remarks about how Grace's medical knowledge was outdated, how her simple lifestyle was embarrassing, how it must be confusing to understand modern technology at her age. Grace had tried to brush it off, attributing it to pre-wedding stress or generational differences, but the verbal contempt had escalated into physical violence. The first time Victoria had actually hurt her, Grace had been too shocked to even process it. It happened in Alexander's kitchen, when Grace had accidentally used Victoria's expensive Japanese chef's knife to chop vegetables for soup. Victoria had grabbed Grace's wrist and twisted it violently, her voice dropping to a cold whisper as she explained that Grace's old hands shouldn't touch things worth more than she probably earned in a week of nursing. When Grace had tried to apologize, Victoria had shoved her hard against the counter edge, knocking the wind out of her. Since that day, the violence had escalated. Victoria would grab Grace's hair and yank her head back when she felt Grace was in the way. She had thrown a ceramic vase that shattered near Grace's head when Grace had suggested a traditional Irish blessing for the wedding. Once, Victoria had twisted Grace's arm behind her back until Grace cried out, then threatened that if Grace ever told Alexander, Victoria would convince him his mother was developing dementia and needed to be institutionalized. Victoria had perfected the dual persona. In Alexander's presence, she was the thoughtful future daughter-in-law who asked Grace's opinion on wedding details, brought her herbal tea, even offered to help set up her streaming services. But the instant Alexander's attention shifted, Victoria's mask would drop, revealing something cold and cruel beneath. Grace had tried to convince herself she was overreacting, that perhaps she had somehow provoked these incidents. But she knew the truth. Victoria didn't love Alexander. She loved his success, his connections, his position in the tech world. Grace was an inconvenient reminder that Alexander came from working-class roots, that his mother was a nurse rather than a tech executive or venture capitalist. And Grace, who had spent her entire life protecting her son, couldn't bear the thought of destroying his happiness by exposing the woman he was so proud to be marrying. So she remained silent, absorbing the violence in private, inventing explanations for the occasional injury. Alexander noticed. She told him she had bumped into furniture, that her balance wasn't what it used to be, that she was clumsy. He believed her because he was consumed with product launches, investor meetings, and expansion plans, too busy to look closely enough to see the fear in his mother's eyes. Alexander returned to the estate that evening energized. His team had just successfully defended a major client from a sophisticated ransomware attack, demonstrating the effectiveness of their new AI-driven threat detection. He expected to find Victoria at home. Her Tesla was in the driveway, and he was looking forward to sharing the victory with her. He entered through the main house, calling out a greeting. No response. The house felt strangely quiet. He set down his laptop bag and started toward the stairs, assuming Victoria might be in their bedroom. But then he heard something that made him stop. A voice from the direction of the guest house, strained and frightened. He could see through the window that the guest house door was open, light spilling out into the rainy evening. Alexander moved quickly across the covered walkway, his instincts telling him something was wrong. As he approached, he could hear Victoria's voice, sharp and vicious, saying something about pathetic and burden. Then he heard his mother's voice, but not like he had ever heard it before. She was pleading, saying, "Please, I'll stay out of your way. Please stop." Alexander reached the doorway and froze. The scene before him would be burned into his memory forever. Victoria had his mother backed into the corner of the living room, and she had just grabbed Grace by the hair, yanking her head back at a painful angle. His mother's face was contorted with pain and fear, tears streaming down her cheeks, and she had her hands up defensively as if trying to protect herself from further violence. The shock lasted only a heartbeat before it transformed into rage. Pure, visceral rage, unlike anything Alexander had ever experienced. He had built his career on logical thinking, systematic problem-solving, controlled responses. But seeing his mother, his kind, selfless mother, who had worked herself to exhaustion for him, being physically attacked by the woman he had planned to marry, shattered every bit of that control. Alexander's voice, when he found it, was barely above a whisper, but carried enough intensity to make Victoria release Grace's hair and spin around. "Get your hands off her." Just 5 words, but they vibrated with barely contained fury. Victoria's face cycled rapidly through emotions, shock, fear, then calculation as her mind raced to construct an explanation. "Alexander, thank God you're home. Your mother was having an episode. She became agitated, and I was just trying to—" "Stop!" Alexander cut her off, his voice still quiet, but carrying an edge that made Victoria take a step back. He moved past her, going directly to Grace. His mother was trembling violently, one hand pressed to her scalp, where Victoria had grabbed her hair, and when she looked up at him, he saw something that broke his heart. Absolute terror, shame, and underneath it all, relief. "Mom," he said gently, and at the tenderness in his voice contrasted with the fury in his eyes. Grace's face crumpled completely. Alexander helped her sit down on the couch, and that's when he saw them. Bruises on her wrists in various stages of healing. The way she held her left shoulder as if it hurt. A fading mark on her forearm that looked like finger impressions. "How long?" he asked quietly. still kneeling beside his mother's chair. Grace couldn't speak, could only shake her head, tears flowing freely. Alexander finally turned to look at Victoria, and what he saw in her face confirmed everything. She had already pivoted to her defense strategy, her expression shifting to concern and confusion, preparing her narrative. But Alexander had seen what he saw. More importantly, he suddenly understood all the signs he had been too distracted to notice. The weight loss, the way his mother had stopped joining them for dinners, the nervousness whenever Victoria was around. "She's been acting so strangely lately," Victoria started, her voice taking on a practiced tone of worried sympathy. "I think she might need a neurological evaluation. Early dementia can manifest as paranoia." "I saw you," Alexander interrupted, his voice still eerily calm. "I saw you grab her hair. I heard you threaten her. And judging by these bruises, this isn't the first time you've put your hands on my mother." Victoria's carefully constructed expression flickered. "You're misunderstanding what you saw. She grabbed my arm first, and I was just—" "Mom," Alexander said, never taking his eyes off Victoria. "Is that true? Did you grab her arm first?" Grace looked up at her son, at the man she had sacrificed everything for, and finally found her voice. "No," she whispered. "She's been hurting me for months, but I didn't want to ruin your happiness. I thought if I just stayed quiet, if I stayed out of the way." Those words hit Alexander like a physical blow. His mother had endured months of abuse, months to protect his happiness. While he had been celebrating product launches and investor meetings, his mother had been suffering violence 20 yards away from where he slept. "How long?" he asked again, this time looking at Grace with such anguish in his eyes that she almost couldn't bear it. Since around March," Grace managed. At first it was just words. Then she started. Grace gestured helplessly at her bruised wrists. "I'm sorry, Alexander. I should have told you, but I didn't want—" "No," Alexander said firmly, his voice breaking slightly. "No, Mom, you have nothing to apologize for. This is not your fault. This is my fault for not seeing it, for being so wrapped up in work that I didn't notice what was happening in my own home." He stood slowly and turned to face Victoria. What he saw in her expression now was no longer feigned concern, but cold contempt. She had realized her performance wasn't working, and she had abandoned the pretense. "Your mother is weak," Victoria said flatly, her voice stripped of its usual charm. "She's a burden. Alexander, do you know what people in our circles say? Pierce's mother is a retired nurse from some public hospital. That's what they say at conferences, at investor dinners. You've built this incredible company, created this image, and she undermines it just by existing in your life." The cruelty of the words, the calculated viciousness, left Alexander momentarily speechless. This woman, this complete stranger wearing Victoria's face, was not someone he had ever known. The person he thought he loved had never existed. "Get out," Alexander said quietly. "Be reasonable, Alexander. You can't throw away what we have because of—" "Get out!" The shout seemed to surprise them all. Alexander never raised his voice, but he was shaking with barely controlled rage now. "Get out of my home! Get away from my mother! Get out of my life! We're done! The engagement is over! The wedding is cancelled! You have 1 hour to remove your belongings from my house, or I will have security physically remove you and box up everything you leave behind." Victoria's face transformed into something ugly, her beauty warping into sneering contempt. "You're making a huge mistake. I have connections throughout the tech industry. One word from me, and investors will hear things about Pierce Technologies that could tank your valuation." "Try it," Alexander said, his voice ice cold now, the fury replaced by something more dangerous, calculated resolve. "I have 3 billion reasons why that won't work, and I'm friends with every major tech journalist on the West Coast. You want to play that game? I'll bury you so deep in the industry you'll never work in tech again. I'll make sure everyone knows exactly why our engagement ended. So go ahead, make your threats. See how that works out for you." He pulled his phone from his pocket. I'm calling my head of security. You have exactly 1 hour. And Victoria? He looked at her with utter contempt. If you ever come near my mother again, if you even breathe in her direction, I will use every resource I have to destroy you. Legally, professionally, socially. Do you understand me? Victoria stared at him for a long moment, perhaps finally recognizing that she had miscalculated catastrophically. Alexander Pierce might be a tech genius, but he was still the kid whose nurse mother had worked double shifts to give him opportunities, and she had just made the fatal error of hurting the one person who mattered more to him than anything else. She left without another word, her heels clicking angrily across the hardwood. Alexander heard her moving around upstairs in the main house, slamming drawers, and he didn't care. He went back to his mother, who was still shaking on the couch. I'm so sorry, Grace whispered. I should have told you sooner. I just didn't want to. Mom, stop! Alexander said, sitting beside her and carefully taking her hands, mindful of the bruises. This is not your fault. None of this is your fault. I failed you. I was so busy building my company, chasing success, that I didn't see what was happening to you. That's on me, and I will never forgive myself for that. They sat together as the sound of Victoria's departure faded, car starting, tires on wet pavement, the gate closing. Only then did Alexander allow himself to fully feel the weight of what had just happened. He helped Grace to her bedroom, made her chamomile tea the way she used to make it for him when he was young, and stayed with her until she fell into an exhausted sleep. Then he went back to the main house and started making calls. His attorney first, to ensure Victoria would be legally barred from any contact with Grace or access to his properties. His doctor second, to arrange a private examination for Grace in the morning. His head of security third, to change all access codes, install additional cameras around the guest house, and assign a security detail if needed. But as he sat in his home office at 2 a.m, staring at a photo of Grace at his MIT graduation, her face beaming with pride, despite the exhaustion from having worked a night shift before flying across the country, Alexander realized that practical measures weren't enough. Something fundamental had broken in him tonight. Or perhaps something had finally become clear that should have been obvious all along. He had spent 15 years building a company, accumulating wealth, chasing industry recognition. He had let his mother endure months of abuse because he was too distracted by product roadmaps and investor decks to notice her fear. Alexander made a decision in those quiet pre-dawn hours. He would step back from daily operations, promoting his CTO to CEO. He would remain chairman but delegate the day-to-day responsibilities that had consumed him. He would use his technical skills and resources for something that actually mattered. In the following weeks, Alexander did exactly that. He restructured the company leadership, surprising his board, but standing firm on his decision. He arranged for a therapist to work with Grace, someone who specialized in elder abuse trauma. The sessions were difficult. Grace carried so much shame and guilt, but slowly she began to heal. He spent his newfound time actually being present for his mother, cooking meals together, taking walks around Mercer Island, simply sitting and talking about things they had never had time to discuss. Grace gradually relaxed, the fear slowly leaving her eyes, her appetite returning, her laughter coming more easily. But Alexander's mind kept returning to a disturbing realization. If he hadn't come home early that evening, if he hadn't witnessed Victoria's violence with his own eyes, how long would the abuse have continued? Grace would never have told him. She would have endured it silently until… what? Until Victoria succeeded in having her institutionalized. Until the stress literally killed her. And how many other elderly people were suffering similar abuse right now, with no one coming home early to save them? Alexander began researching elder abuse, applying his analytical mind to understanding the scope of the problem. The statistics were horrifying. 1 in 10 older adults experience some form of abuse, most often from family members, and like Grace, most suffered in silence, too ashamed or afraid to report it. The existing systems were woefully inadequate, helplines that were rarely answered, reports that went uninvestigated, a social services infrastructure that was overwhelmed and underfunded. But Alexander was a tech founder. He built systems to solve problems. And he had just found a problem that needed solving. He assembled a small team, engineers he trusted, social workers who understood elder abuse, attorneys who specialized in elder law. He funded the project personally, not wanting it tied to Pierce Technologies or subject to investor pressures. And he built something that had never existed before. The application was called SafeGuardian. It looked like a simple health tracking app, medication reminders, doctor's appointments, fall detection. But hidden within it was a sophisticated reporting system. An elderly person could discreetly report abuse through seemingly innocent actions, marking a medication as causing discomfort, triggered a wellness check, rating a bad day multiple times in a week, alerted a case manager, even a specific pattern of button presses, activated emergency services. The app connected to a network of trained responders, social workers, lawyers, law enforcement specialists, who understood elder abuse and could intervene quickly and appropriately. It used AI to detect patterns that might indicate abuse, sudden changes in behavior, unexplained absences, concerning biometric data from smartwatches, but it was designed with privacy and agency at its core. Elderly users maintained control, could customize their alert preferences, could choose who had access to what information. Alexander beta tested it first with Grace and members of a local support group she had joined. The feedback was overwhelmingly positive, but also heartbreaking. Story after story of abuse, isolation, suffering that no one had known about or had the tools to address. He launched SafeGuardian as a free application 6 months after Victoria's expulsion. Media coverage was significant. Tech billionaire creates app to prevent elder abuse after his mother's ordeal ran in multiple outlets. Alexander gave interviews, telling Grace's story with her permission, not hiding his own failure to see what was happening. The response was overwhelming. Within weeks, hundreds of thousands of downloads. Within months, the first major intervention. An elderly man in Portland, whose grandson was financially exploiting him, detected through the app's unusual spending pattern alerts. Then another case, and another. It was at a SafeGuardian volunteer training session in Seattle that Alexander met Maya Patel. She was a hospice social worker who had signed up to be part of the response network. Alexander was there to explain the technical features of the system, and he noticed her immediately. Not just because she was attractive, with warm dark eyes and a quick smile, but because of the intelligent questions she asked, about how to balance technology with human connection, how to ensure the app helped rather than replaced personal relationships. After the training, they ended up talking in the parking lot for over an hour. Maya had immigrated from India with her family when she was 10, and her grandmother, who had lived with them, had been emotionally abused by one of Maya's uncles. Maya had been too young to understand what was happening at the time, but looking back, she recognized all the signs. That experience had driven her to social work, to hospice care, to finding ways to protect vulnerable elderly people. Alexander found himself drawn to Maya's authenticity, her deep understanding of the cultural complexities of elder abuse, the way she talked about her patients with such respect and compassion. But he was cautious now, hyper-aware of his own poor judgment with Victoria. He had been so wrong before. Over the following months, Alexander and Maya kept crossing paths at SafeGuardian events, at elder advocacy meetings, at the support groups Grace still attended. Their friendship developed naturally, built on shared purpose rather than romantic performance. Maya met Grace multiple times, and the genuine affection between them was obvious. Maya would listen to Grace's stories about nursing in the 80s, ask about her herb garden, remember details from previous conversations. Grace watched carefully, hopeful but protective. She saw how Maya treated everyone the same, whether they were tech billionaires or elderly people on Medicaid, whether they could offer her connections or had nothing to give. She saw how Maya's kindness was consistent, not performative. This woman was nothing like Victoria. Nearly a year after Victoria's expulsion, Alexander finally asked Maya on an actual date. They went to a small Thai restaurant Maya loved in the International District. Nothing fancy, just authentic food and genuine conversation. That dinner stretched into 3 hours of talking, laughing, sharing stories about their grandmothers and mothers, about what they wanted their lives to mean. When Alexander walked Maya to her car, she kissed him goodnight. Quick and sweet, and told him she'd been wondering if he was ever going to stop being so careful around her. Their relationship was everything his engagement to Victoria hadn't been. Maya didn't care about his net worth or his industry status. She drove a used Prius, lived in a modest apartment in Ballard, and was perfectly happy with hiking dates and cooking dinner together. What she valued was authenticity, kindness, meaningful work. She made Alexander laugh, challenged his assumptions when he fell back into tech bro patterns, reminded him that technology was a tool but human connection was the goal. Grace watched her son fall in love again, genuinely this time, and felt only joy. She got to know Maya through dinners at the house, volunteering together at Safeguardian events, walks around the island, when Maya started bringing Indian sweets for Grace to try, when she asked Grace to teach her some Irish recipes, when she simply sat with Grace during the difficult therapy sessions. Grace knew this was real. One Sunday afternoon, about 15 months after Victoria had been expelled from their lives, Alexander found his mother in her herb garden. He sat beside her on the bench he had built, watching her work with practiced hands. After a comfortable silence, he told Grace that he was thinking about asking Maya to marry him. He wanted to know what his mother thought, if she had any concerns. Grace set down her gardening scissors and looked at her son with those calm green eyes that had seen so much. Maya is everything that woman wasn't, she said simply. She's genuine, she's kind, she values what matters, and most importantly, she loves you for who you are, not for what you've built or who you know. She paused, then smiled. But Alexander, you don't need my permission. You're asking because you want my blessing, and you have it. But you already know Maya is right for you. I can see it in how you are with her. You're more yourself than you've been in years. Alexander felt tears prick his eyes. I almost married someone who hurt you, Mom. How can I trust my own judgment? Because you learned, Grace said firmly. You made a mistake. Yes. You were blind. Yes. But when you saw the truth, you acted. You protected me. You changed your whole life. That's what matters, not that you were fooled, but that you learned and grew. And you're being careful now, which is wise. But don't let Victoria's cruelty make you doubt something good when you've found it. Alexander proposed to Maya on a quiet evening at the Safeguardian office, surrounded by monitors showing the thousands of elderly people the app was now protecting. There was no performance, no spectacle, no perfect Instagram moment. Just two people who had found something real in each other, built on shared values and genuine connection. Maya said yes through happy tears, and they celebrated with Grace over Indian takeout in the guesthouse kitchen, exactly the way they all preferred. The wedding, when it happened, was nothing like what Alexander had planned with Victoria. It was held at a small community center in Ballard, decorated by volunteers from Safeguardian and Grace's support group. There were 80 people, real friends, family, social workers, nurses, elderly people, whose lives had been changed by the app. No tech press, no industry VIPs, no strategic networking, just people who actually mattered. Alexander's vows made everyone cry because they were so honest. He talked about how his mother had taught him what real strength looked like: quiet sacrifice, unconditional love, courage in suffering. He thanked Maya for showing him the difference between image and substance, for loving not just him, but his mother, for understanding that technology should serve humanity rather than the other way around. He promised to spend their life together focused on what actually mattered rather than what looked impressive on paper. Alexander and Maya built a life that prioritized meaning over achievement. They lived in the Mercer Island house with Grace, who had her own space but was part of daily life. Alexander continued to chair Pierce Technologies but spent most of his time on Safeguardian, which had expanded to serve over 2 million elderly users across North America. The app had evolved based on user feedback, adding features for different languages and cultural contexts, integrating with existing social services, creating community connections so isolated elderly people could find companionship. It had prevented hundreds of documented cases of elder abuse, helped thousands more access resources and support. But more than the numbers, Alexander found meaning in the individual stories. The elderly woman in Vancouver whose daughter was stealing her pension checks, caught through Safeguardian's financial monitoring. The man in Phoenix whose nursing home was medicating him excessively to keep him docile, detected through the app's medication tracking, and Grace's trained eye reviewing the case. The grandmother in Chicago who was being isolated and emotionally abused by her son's girlfriend, who used the app's discreet messaging to reach out for help. Each story reminded Alexander of his mother, of how easily she could have been one of those statistics if he hadn't come home early, if he hadn't seen Victoria's true nature with his own eyes. Years passed peacefully. Alexander and Maya adopted 2 children through foster care, siblings who needed a stable home, and Grace became a grandmother in every way that mattered. She taught the kids to make Irish soda bread, read them stories about Alexander's childhood, showed them her herb garden, and explained which plants helped which ailments. When Grace passed away peacefully in her sleep at 76, it was in the guest house she loved, surrounded by photos of her grandchildren and shelves full of books Alexander had given her. At her funeral, Alexander gave a eulogy that was unflinchingly honest about everything. His success that had blinded him, Victoria's abuse of his mother, his failure to see what was happening, his eventual awakening and the work that had come from it. "My mother taught me 2 fundamental lessons," Alexander said to the packed community center. "First, through her decades of sacrifice and love, she taught me that real wealth is in relationships. Real success is in service. Real strength is in gentleness. And second, through her suffering and her courage to finally accept help, she taught me that it's never too late to open your eyes, to see what you've been missing, to use whatever resources you have to protect others." He paused, looking at Maya and their children in the front row. "I spent years building technology, accumulating wealth, chasing recognition in the tech industry. I was so busy being successful that I almost lost what actually mattered. My mother's abuse, and my discovery of it shattered my priorities and gave me the chance to build something meaningful. I hate that she suffered. I hate that I didn't see it sooner. But I'm grateful that I woke up, that we had those final years together, that her suffering led to a system that now protects millions of other people's mothers." The years continued. Safeguardian kept growing, expanding internationally, partnering with healthcare systems and governments. Alexander and Maya grew old together. Their children grew up understanding that success meant service, that technology should empower the vulnerable, rather than exploit them. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, Alexander would sit in Grace's herb garden, now maintained by Maya with the same care his mother had shown. He would think about the journey that had brought him here. The success and blindness, the betrayal and awakening, the guilt and redemption, the loss and building something meaningful from that loss. He thought about Victoria sometimes, not with anger but with a kind of distant understanding. She had been the catalyst, the wake-up call, the force that had shattered his illusions. She had taught him what he didn't want, what shallow ambition looked like, what cruelty hid behind beautiful facades. But mostly he thought about his mother, her strength in suffering, her love that had endured even when he didn't deserve it. The lessons she had taught through both her daily example and her final ordeal. She had wanted him to be successful, yes, but she had wanted even more for him to be good, to use his gifts to help others, to measure his life by what he protected rather than what he built. And in the end, Alexander had learned. It had taken a terrible discovery, and he would always carry the guilt of not seeing sooner. But he had learned, and he had built something that honored his mother's sacrifice. Not just an app, but a movement. Not just technology, but a commitment to protecting the vulnerable, to believing those who spoke up about abuse, to using privilege and resources in service of those who had neither. Alexander Pierce had chased the wrong metrics and nearly lost everything that mattered. but his mother's suffering had opened his eyes, and he had spent the rest of his life honoring her sacrifice by finally understanding what she had always known, that real innovation isn't about disrupting markets, it's about protecting people, that real wealth isn't about valuation, it's about love, that real success isn't about being featured in TechCrunch, it's about using whatever gifts you have to make sure others don't suffer needlessly. The Safeguardian app would continue protecting elderly people long after Alexander was gone, a living monument to a nurse who had endured abuse in silence until her son finally saw. That was Grace Pierce's legacy, not suffering but the transformation of her son, and through him the protection of millions of others. Every story carries within it an echo of our shared humanity. If this story has touched your heart, share it with someone special. Leave us a comment about what you felt, and subscribe to join us for more soul-reaching stories, because every life tells a story that deserves to be heard. See you next time.